and people online, hi too. So hi, I'm Stephanie Droop. I'm doing a PhD at Edinburgh. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm going to show you how, more like when actually, we'll leave how for now, how people can infer the epistemic or learning goals of others in simulated microworlds. First, we'll set the scene as a interface between intuitive physics and social cognition. And we'll have a real high-level overview of some existing work in active learning and the ideal observer model, because that underpins my work here. Then we'll move on to the task in hand, my experiment, its results, and some qualitative insights from the textual responses that people gave. So to set the scene, what is this scene? Embodied agents, us in the world, we're often interacting with objects, but we're also observing other people interacting with objects. So there's this dual level of uncertainty where the observer, like a 3-year-old kid at nursery, playing with toys, they might learn how the toy works or how gravity works by watching other kids interacting with the toy and playing. Or if you see somebody like this lady, if you see somebody doing the same action with their hands out like this with something in each hand, you just know she's weighing them or comparing them. To sporting commentary, think how sophisticated the nuances of interpreting people's actions on the pitch. Or that classic work from Heider and Simmel, we have no problem in attributing intention and agency to very minimal agents on the basis just of how they move. So it'd be great to know how we do that. It could really help robotics. It could help, I just want to understand how we work, really. So the existing work we're going to look at is these references on the side. This is from my supervisor, Neil. This here is a diagram to show a simulated micro world, a billiard world, because to study something as sophisticated and as rich as human behavior in the world, we need a controlled environment. So you program it into using a physics simulator. You can control the properties like the mass of A and B, say. We're going to see a real version in a minute. You can give it other physical properties like varying the forces between them or the friction or elasticity, whatever. But the point is it's very precisely controlled on your screen. And you can give it to your players to interact with. And that gives a kind of sandbox or a kind of way of simulating how people might go in the real world. It's quite realistic, but we track everything they're doing through where their finger touches the screen. So a ball, say ball A, will get a black outline when someone's highlighted it, like selected it, and they can shake it around or do whatever they want with it. So this is modeled by these authors here using an ideal observer model where every possible trajectory that ball A, as it goes past B, every possible trajectory it could have taken is like simulated forward, and it calculates the likelihood of the path it actually took under different settings. So from that, we get a posterior over all the different, if you're testing the force, say whether it attracts or repels, you would get a posterior over force for the different paths it took. Say it took the south one, path 8, then it would be highly likely that that's a repel. So that the force currently active in the world is repel. And then the entropy of these posteriors shows like the amount of information available from this world. So if we're looking at either force or mass, every single trial would have a force entropy and a mass entropy, and low would be good. So now, finally, onto my experiment. What are we actually doing here? So Bramley and Ruggieri gave me the results of their experiment, where they had active learners interacting with these microworlds. And what they found was that players, when they're allowed to interact with the world, they generate information that's specific to their goals. More than someone who's just passively observing can tell. So they know what the player was doing because they gave them the task. And they also know what's happening at any given point because the ball becomes highlighted. So that's quite key for, we can use that for social inference. So they were good enough to give me their videos and I repurposed them. So I don't know how to get it to play though on this thing. This is an example. We're going to see like how, there we go. So I asked my players, like, what do you think this person was testing for, force or mass? So how do we think? So here they've got B. That black cursor shows where their finger is on the screen. They've got B, they're moving it towards A. They've got B, now they've got A. Those gray ones are just distractors. They can be interacted with, but the question is about A or B. So have a wee think to yourself, can you tell what they're testing? If anyone's brave, you can shout it out, but you also don't have to. That was force. We saw them select A and B and move it very gently and precisely towards the other ones. How about this one? Was this player testing for force or mass? How about we think? Again, if you're feeling brave and you think you know the answer, just shout out. Nice. Why? Nice. Yeah, exactly. So they're doing this sequence where they have to do the same action on each and they get their answers from that. Also, see how some are faster than others or have different like drag and elasticity. We varied that. So yes, exactly. That's a mass one. Those are quite good examples. Like you might think that that's quite an easy task because intuitively we can just see what they're doing, but those are low entropy examples. There's lots of information. The player generated exactly the right information that they wanted. Low entropy. What's more interesting is where it comes apart. Like when you try to find the edge cases, you can tease out what it is that makes it easier for someone to infer the learning goal or not. So I varied the entropy content in the stimuli videos I showed people. So we did a range from high to low, a range of the ground truth, so whether A and B did in fact attract or repel, and which was heavier, A or B. I also varied the presence of that black cross showing the finger. So you can always tell when a ball is selected by this black outline, but maybe the extra information of where the finger actually was on the screen could help as well. So showed it to a bunch of people online and asked a super simple, what was this person testing for? Force or mass? Binary force choice. And what do we find? The dotted line is chance. So in the results, it's too small. High entropy is that group on the left. Low entropy is the group on the right. So force tests are easy to see. People get it right across the board, even when there's high entropy, even without the cursor. Something about force is really easy to see. That's cool. Mass is a different story. It's really hard. People can't get it right unless they have the cursor and unless it's low entropy. That's very interesting. So I refer you back to the Bramley and Ruggieri paper because they have an interesting discussion of how the information is generated and when. The thing about force is that that slow, precise, moving it close to the other one, the information is generated consistently and slowly. Whereas in mass, although there is more information, like objectively, it's very concentrated in these kind of splashes around collisions. And that's no problem for the ideal observer, but it's hard for our perceptual systems and our attention to see. So maybe that's what's going on. So it does seem that we use objective information content to guide our responses, but it's not the only signal. So it'd be nice to know what else is going on. So how? I don't know. Well, can we just ask them? So you hear so much in psychology about how self-report is unreliable, but I'm a total newbie with all the naivety of the beginner and without anything else to go on. I just asked them. So there was a text box at the end saying, how do you think you solved this task? What clues did you use? And they didn't have to answer. It was their own time they were giving. But actually 3/4 of people did type very meaningful, detailed responses. That's not including things like don't know, not sure. And of those text responses, many of them contained some kind of reference to an action or strategy, which would be a behavior that you could reproduce from the description. So something like, for that force example we saw, if something like moving the balls gently and precisely towards each other or hovering close to each other. They mentioned lots of adverbs like gently, slowly, precisely. For mass, that was things like this gentleman here said, like they, in sequence, bounced the balls in turn. Mentioning strategy in the text responses predicted success on the task. Another thing I've said in the paper, which actually, I don't know, I'm not sure about it, but they attempt to isolate some kind of property. So people often mention this kind of interim goal, like trying to see this, trying to see that. They're trying to see which floats higher. They were trying to see, which unfortunately didn't predict success on the task, but it is just further evidence of this hider and simul, like we just have no problem attributing intention and agency to what people are doing. Another thing that's exciting, which we'd like to find a way to fit into this ideal observer model, is that people often mention aspects of sequence and timing, which help them solve the task. So they often mention that in the force trials, the player appeared to leave the balls alone to generate more information. So in fact, interfering may have hampered what they see. They often say that they knew what they were testing because the player stopped interacting right after a particularly informative motion. And they say aspects like they had to test both A and B in sequence to get the mass. So this is the further direction of how to build this into the modeling. Basically, that's it. In summary, people can infer the epistemic or learning goals of others in these very fine-grained but quite minimal environments. Sometimes with the cursor, sometimes without. Objective information content as measured by entropy is very useful, but it's not the only signal. So we need to find what else is going on. People seem to recognize bundles of strategies together as what's informative, as what they would do themselves. Sequences, timing, and absences of action can be as informative as the actions themselves. Thanks to Neil, he's great. I'm here because I'm funded by UKRI. I'm in the Centre for Doctoral Training of Natural Language Processing. Thanks for listening. Email me with any questions, but I can take a few right now.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. So I'm not a physicist, and so it took me a second to think about like what force and mass were meant to be in this context. And so I wondered, just as like a clarifying question, if you could say a little more about what you told participants about what it means to sort of test for force versus test for mass.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Good point. I could have had more about that. So we instructed participants that this was like looking down on an air hockey table, that there was no gravity in this world, but there was pairwise forces between the balls. So the balls always attracted or repelled each other to varying degrees. We also told them that one was always heavier, either A or B was heavier than the other. That's it.
That's really helpful.
We showed them something. We showed them an example without anyone interacting, just of like the balls being set off and then colliding, and that's it.
This is very funny. Thanks, that was cool. I'm wondering, in your world, there's a mixture of what makes force and mass actually evident, and then how the people go about getting that information, right? So there's both mass is just harder to see, and also mass is harder for people to get information about. And I wondered if you've thought about trying to separate those. So you have like basically more and less maybe experienced or competent people who you're watching explore the world, and more or less easy properties to extract, so that you could separate the observer's inference about the learner versus the observer's inference about the world itself.
Oh, cool. Yeah, in fact, that I hadn't thought about that, but we have been looking for a way to kind of get a ceiling response. So like a task that would be easy to kind of, because it is trying to do 2 steps at once, so we need to kind of split it. So that's a great idea. Especially maybe just watching videos of somebody very skilled who is generating precise, good information. Maybe that would be a great first step. Thank you very much. I'm gonna make a note. Are there any questions online, by the way?
Nope, there's nothing here.
Okay, cool. Then I'll ask another one. Yeah, that was really great. And it's a nice follow-up, I think, from Rebecca's question. So I was wondering to what extent you think it's probably fairly intuitive what one should do in this task, even never have played it before, like in order to reveal force. It might be less intuitive what actions I should take in this task, never having played it before, in order to figure out the mass of the objects. So basically what I'm wondering is like what you predict would happen if the participants who are trying to make the inference about somebody else's intentions were to play the game a little bit at the beginning themselves. Like whether you think that that would improve their performance because they, you know, figure out like, oh, the ways in which they can actually interact with the objects, and so figure out, oh, that's the kind of thing that I would do to figure out the mass, and now I'm better able at detecting it when somebody else is doing it.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, cool. Can we talk later about that?
We can, yeah. Thank you.
Cool. Because the people often, they think that to move it close to the other, but when they first do it, if there is a strong attract, then they're just going to stick together, and then like your trial's ended because you find it hard to unstick them, or they follow each other around, and it actually might not be as informative as they first thought. So maybe it is for both force and mass. It might be better to give them a practice. Cool.
Is there time for another question?
Sure.
Yeah. That was really nice work.
Oh, thank you.
And nice talk. I was going to ask the same questions that those folks asked, but I'll ask a different question. So I was really interested in some of the qualitative results you showed with the like describing the sort of sub goals, I guess, like, and I think you said that it wasn't correlated maybe with success on the task or something like that, or
Yeah, the interim sub goals, they were much rarer than mentioning the strategy. And having mentioned I got 2 independent coders without knowing what they were really coding for, I didn't tell them, just to see if they defined that as having an interim goal in that text response.
right.
And presence of like 1 in that column from the coders did not predict the participant's success on that trial, like in a logistic regression.
Right.
So so I don't know how to interpret
But
that.
but I think both that and the strategies are still give insight into what might be going on in general in people's heads. They might not have said that they were doing that, even if they were thinking that. And I think it really would be an interesting direction to explore further in terms of like this whole spirit of inverse planning, like as other talks talked about, because it seems like what you have is a very rich kind of inverse planning, where it's not just about inferring the goal, but inferring the whole plan structure that the person has in their head to test that goal.
Yeah.
There was some work that was presented at CogSci last year from Shen, or Tanxi Shen, who's a student at MIT, who also has a really interesting computational approach extending inverse planning to actually have planning algorithms in there. And so you might look at their work also, because it could be a way of trying to model some of this much richer kind of inverse planning behavior that you're seeing in your very beautiful work here. So
Great, thanks. That's great. That ties in with Chris Lucas advised me to take it in a reinforcement learning to look at skills, because skills is a
yeah, that's a
thing.
related thing, like our skills
Right.
and options and stuff. Yeah,
Great.
very interesting.
Well, thank you.
We're out of time.
Guess we're finished.